Hello, and welcome back to the Altitude Archives, the channel where we explore the most compelling and confounding stories to ever unfold at 30,000 feet. It is wonderful to have you with us again. Before we prepare for departure, I want to give a huge thank you to our amazing community. Your comments and theories on our last case were absolutely fascinating. If this is your first time flying with us, we delve into narratives of mystery, crime, and human drama that all share one unique setting: the sky. To ensure you have a reserved seat for every story, please do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the notification bell. And now, a necessary announcement. The following account is a work of fiction. The airline, characters, names, and events portrayed in this narrative are entirely the product of the imagination. Any resemblance to actual events or persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This story deals with mature themes and may be disturbing for some viewers. A modern passenger jet is a marvel of engineering. A sealed metal tube where hundreds of souls place their trust in the crew and the machine carrying them across continents. It is a place of absolute control and procedure. But for one air hostess, that controlled environment was not a sanctuary. It was a weapon. Today, we unravel the shocking act of a woman who, when confronted with the ghost of her past, committed the perfect murder during a routine flight miles above the earth. The practiced, serene smile of Clara Reed was a work of art. It was a masterpiece of professional composure, honed over a decade of calming nervous flyers, defusing minor conflicts over armrests, and serving lukewarm coffee with an unwavering grace. In the rigidly structured world of air travel, Clara was the ideal flight attendant. Her uniform was always impeccably pressed, her movements efficient and fluid, her voice a soothing balm of practiced reassurance. She was the calm at the center of the controlled chaos that was a long-haul international flight. Today's flight, a 12-hour journey from Dubai to New York, was shaping up to be just another exercise in routine. The Airbus A380, a behemoth of the skies, was boarding smoothly. Clara stood at the entrance to the first-class cabin, her posture perfect, her smile a welcoming beacon as the world's elite flowed past her. She greeted them by name, a small touch of personalized service that her airline prided itself on, her eyes briefly flicking down to the tablet in her hand to match a face to a seat number. A sheik with his entourage, a tech CEO glued to his phone, a quiet, elegant woman who was a famous novelist. And then, she saw the name on the manifest, and for the first time in her 10-year career, the mask of professional serenity threatened to crack. Mr. Julian Vance, Seat 3A. The name itself meant nothing, but the face that looked up from the tablet and met her eyes was not that of a stranger. It was a face that had haunted her waking moments and terrorized her dreams for 5 long, agonizing years. He was older now, the boyish charm replaced by a more mature, predatory confidence. The name was different, but the eyes were the samey piercing, intelligent blue that could charm the trust out of a saint and the life savings out of a widow. The man walking towards her, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, was Marcus Thorne. A jolt, cold and electric, shot through Clara's body. The air in the pressurized cabin suddenly felt thin, unbreathable. For a split second, the polished, sterile environment of the A380 melted away, replaced by a flood of sensory memories. The scent of his cologne, the rough stubble feel of his cheek against hers, the sound of his laughter, a sound that had once been her favorite music and was now the soundtrack to her ruin. She had met Marcus when she was a different person, younger, more naive, a flight attendant with a prestigious European airline, full of dreams of seeing the world. He had been a passenger, a charismatic art dealer who had swept her off her feet during a layover in Rome. Their romance had been a whirlwind, a cinematic fantasy of 5-star hotels, passionate nights, and promises of a shared, beautiful future. He was brilliant, funny, and seemed to adore her with a fierce, all-consuming passion. He had learned her dreams, her fears, her deepest vulnerabilities, and had used them to weave a web of such exquisite complexity that she had never even felt its silken threads until it was far too late. The con had been deceptively simple. He had told her he was brokering a deal for a rare artifact, a small, ancient statuette that needed to be transported discreetly to a private buyer in Asia. He had spun a tale of corporate espionage and rival collectors, making the secrecy seem romantic and thrilling. He had convinced her to use her position, her ability to move through customs with less scrutiny, to carry the package for him. He had showered her with gifts, paid off her modest debts, and made her feel like a partner in his glamorous, high-stakes world. The package, of course, had not contained a statuette. It had contained a set of expertly forged bearer bonds, the final piece in a sophisticated fraud scheme that had siphoned millions from a charitable foundation. When the scheme had collapsed, as they always do, Marcus had vanished. He had simply ceased to exist, leaving Clara to take the fall. The evidence, all circumstantial but damningly convincing, had pointed directly at her. She had been arrested, her name dragged through the mud. She had lost her job, her reputation, and her life savings on legal fees. But the true cost had been far greater. Her father, a proud, hard-working man, had used his entire retirement fund to bail her out and fund her defense. The stress and the shame had been too much for his weak heart. He had suffered a massive, fatal coronary a week before she was finally cleared of the most serious charges, the authorities reluctantly concluding she was an unwitting pawn, not a co-conspirator. She had been left with nothing but a mountain of debt, a tarnished professional record, and a grief so profound it had hollowed her out, leaving behind a cold, dense core of pure, unadulterated hatred. It had taken her years to rebuild her life, to find a new job with a less prestigious airline, to piece together the shattered fragments of her existence. And now, the architect of her destruction, the ghost who had haunted her for half a decade, was strolling down the aisle of her aircraft, smiling at her as if she were just another uniformed servant. "Good evening," he said. His voice the same smooth, confident baritone she remembered. He handed her his ticket. Julian Vance. Seat 3A. Clara's training, the years of practice discipline, took over. Her face, which for a moment had been a mask of shock, snapped back into its default setting of pleasant neutrality. "Of course, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice impossibly steady. "Welcome aboard. It's the window seat, just on your right." Their eyes met for a fraction of a second too long. A flicker of something, recognition, confusion, crossed his face. He knew her from somewhere, but the context was wrong. The confident, adoring girl he had known was gone, replaced by this poised, unreadable woman in a uniform. He gave a small, dismissive smile and moved on to his seat, already pulling out his phone, already forgetting her. But Clara would not forget. As she resumed her duties, her mind was a maelstrom. The carefully constructed dam she had built around her trauma had shattered, and 5 years of suppressed rage came roaring back to life. She operated on autopilot, her body going through the familiar motions of pre-flight checks and safety demonstrations while her mind raced. She watched him from a distance. He was not alone. In the seat next to him, 3B, was a young, beautiful woman, her eyes full of the same naive adoration that had once filled Clara's. He was laughing with her, his hand resting possessively on her knee. He was wearing an obscenely expensive watch, the kind that would have paid off her father's debts 10 times over. He was living a life of luxury, a life funded by the ruin of others under a new name with a new victim, and he was utterly, blissfully without a conscience. In that moment, a decision, cold and clear and absolute, formed in the hollowed-out core of her being. This was not a coincidence. This was a reckoning. The universe, in its cruel, ironic wisdom, had delivered her tormentor to her. It had placed him in a sealed metal tube, 30,000 feet in the air, miles from any hope of rescue. It had made her his caretaker, his server, the one responsible for his comfort and safety. The sheer, poetic justice of it was breathtaking. He had used her world to destroy her. Now she would use her world to destroy him. The plan began to assemble itself in her mind, piece by meticulous piece, with the same precision she used to conduct an emergency landing drill. Could not be messy, could not be obvious. It had to be a perfect, untraceable act, a silent execution hidden in plain sight. Her mind immediately went to the one secret she had carried with her, a dark talisman from her past. Marcus had a secret of his own, a vulnerability he had confessed to her one night in a hotel in Prague, a detail he had likely long forgotten. He had a severe, life-threatening allergy. Not to peanuts or shellfish, the common culprits that airlines were so careful about. His allergy was to something more obscure, more specific: Brazil nuts. He had told her a story about a childhood incident, a single bite of a cookie that had nearly killed him, that had left him with a deep-seated fear of the innocuous-looking nut. He had stressed, carried 2 EpiPens with him wherever he went. Clara's dark secret was a small, lead-lined container, no bigger than a tube of lipstick, that she kept in a hidden pocket of her travel toiletries bag. Inside it was a fine, almost undetectable powder, ground from a single Brazil nut. She had prepared it 3 years ago, during a particularly dark period, a time when her grief and rage had been at their peak. It was a fantasy, a totem of a revenge she never truly believed she would have the opportunity to enact. It was a tangible representation of her hatred, a small, potent vial of death. She had carried it with her on every flight since, a constant, secret companion. The how was now clear. The when and the where began to fall into place. She would need to get the powder into his food or drink without being seen. She would need to neutralize his EpiPens, his only lifeline. And she would need to be the one to respond to the emergency, to control the narrative, to play the part of the heroic flight attendant trying desperately to save a man's life. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign pinged off, Clara began her service. She moved through the cabin with her usual grace, her smile never faltering. When she reached row 3, she addressed the woman first. "Ma'am, can I get you something to drink before dinner?" Then she turned to him. "And for you, Mr. Vance?" He looked up from his laptop, his blue eyes holding a hint of condescending impatience. "Whiskey. Macallan 18 if you have it." "Neat." "Of course, sir," Clara said, her heart a cold, steady drum. It was perfect. A dark liquid, served in a heavy tumbler. The ideal vehicle. She returned to the galley, the small, curtained-off sanctuary that would become her laboratory. Her hands were perfectly steady as she retrieved a bottle of the expensive single malt. She knew she was being watched by the other flight attendant in her section, a cheerful young woman named Emily. She needed a moment of privacy. "Emily, could you do me a favor?" Clara asked, her tone light and professional. "Could you check the stock for the duty-free cart? I think we might be low on the Chanel perfume." As Emily bustled off towards the storage compartment, Clara had her moment. She pulled the galley curtain shut. Her movements were swift and precise. She retrieved the small container from her bag. With a surgeon's care, she unscrewed the cap and tapped a small, lethal dusting of the pale powder into the whiskey. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. She resealed the container and slipped it back into her bag. The entire act took less than 5 seconds. She placed the glass on her silver tray, her expression a mask of placid efficiency. She pulled back the curtain just as Emily returned. "All stocked up on the Chanel," Emily said with a smile. "Perfect. Thank you," Clara replied, her own smile not wavering for an instant. She walked back into the cabin, the glass of poisoned whiskey cool and steady on her tray. She approached seat 3A. Marcus, or Julian, or whatever he called himself now, was engrossed in his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're Macallan 18, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice a soft, polite murmur. He didn't look up, just gestured to the small table beside him. She placed the drink down, the clink of the glass against the surface unnaturally loud in her own ears. As she turned to leave, he finally looked up, a flash of genuine recognition finally dawning in his eyes. "Wait a minute," he said, his head cocked. "Clara? Clara Reed? My God. Is that you?" Clara froze, her back to him. She turned slowly, a look of polite, professional confusion on her face. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice perfectly modulated. "Have we met?" He stared at her for a long moment, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. He saw her uniform, her name tag, her position of service. He saw the power dynamic, and it amused him. "No," he said at last, a dismissive chuckle in his voice. "I must have you confused with someone else." He picked up the glass, swirled the amber liquid, and took a long, slow sip. He held her gaze as he did so, a look of smug triumph in his eyes. He had won. He had gotten away with it all, and here was a ghost from his past, serving him drinks. Clara simply smiled her perfect, serene smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said, before turning and walking away. The ghost had just served him his last meal. The reckoning had begun. The minutes that followed were the longest of Clara's life. Every tick of the clock in the galley, every chime of a passenger call button, every distant peal of laughter from the cabin was amplified, stretched into an agonizing eternity. She went about her duties with a robotic, detached precision, her body performing the familiar tasks, while her mind was a coiled spring of anticipation. She watched Marcus Thorne from the corner of her eye, a predator observing its prey, waiting for the first sign that the poison had begun its insidious work. For a quarter of an hour, there was nothing. He worked on his laptop, he spoke to the woman beside him, he sipped his whiskey. A cold sliver of doubt began to creep into Clara's resolve. Had the powder lost its potency over the years? Had she used too little? Had he, by some miracle, developed a tolerance? The thought that her one chance at justice might fail was more terrifying than the prospect of getting caught. But then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible movement. He cleared his throat, a subtle, rasping sound. He touched his neck, a look of faint annoyance on his face. He took another sip of the whiskey, as if to soothe the irritation. It was the worst thing he could have done. He was feeding the fire. Clara's heart, which had been a cold, steady drum, began to pound with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. It was working. The initial symptoms of anaphylaxis are subtle, easily mistaken for a minor ailment. A tickle in the throat, a sudden itchiness on the palms of the hands. Marcus shifted in his seat, his concentration on his laptop broken. He scratched his hand, then his neck again. The woman beside him, whose name Clara had learned was Sophie, looked at him with concern. "Are you all right, darling?" she asked. "You look a bit flushed." "I'm fine," Marcus rasped, his voice already taking on a hoarse, constricted quality. The air in these things is always so dry. But he wasn't fine. A red flush was creeping up his neck, and a thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. He began to breathe more heavily, each inhalation a little more labored than the last. Panic, the primal fear of suffocation, began to dawn in his intelligent blue eyes. He knew this feeling. He had not felt it since he was a child, but the body does not forget. He started to pat his pockets, his movements becoming more frantic. The jacket of his suit, the inner pockets, his carry-on bag at his feet. His face, which had been flushed, was now beginning to pale, a sickly, grayish tint appearing around his lips. My bag," he wheezed, his voice a strained whisper. "I need my bag." Sophie, her face now a mask of alarm, helped him fumble with the zipper on his expensive leather briefcase. He tore it open, his hands shaking, and began to rummage frantically inside. Clara watched, her expression one of polite, professional curiosity. She took a step closer. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her voice the epitome of calm concern. "My EpiPen," he gasped, his chest heaving. "Allergic reaction. I need my pen." He wasn't finding it. Clara knew he wouldn't. The second, and perhaps most crucial, part of her plan had been executed 20 minutes before he had even boarded the plane. During a brief period when the first-class cabin was empty, she had used her master key to open the overhead compartment above seat 3A. She had located his briefcase and, with the deftness of a pickpocket, had opened it and removed the 2 EpiPens she knew he would have in a side pocket. They were now hidden in a sanitary disposal unit in the rear lavatory, an untraceable tomb of plastic and steel. The controlled chaos began. Passengers in the nearby seats were starting to notice, their expressions turning from curiosity to alarm. Sophie was on the verge of hysterics. "Help him!" she cried, her voice shrill. "He can't breathe." This was Clara's cue. She moved into the role she had been rehearsing in her mind for years. She became the consummate professional in a crisis. "Everyone, please stay calm," she announced, her voice cutting through the rising panic. She knelt beside Marcus's seat. "Sir, can you hear me? My name is Clara. I'm a flight attendant. What are you allergic to?" "Brazil. Nuts," he managed to force out, his eyes wide with terror, pleading with her, the woman he had dismissed as a ghost, to save his life. "Okay, sir. We're going to help you," Clara said, her voice a steady, reassuring anchor. She turned to Emily, who had rushed over. "Emily, notify the captain immediately. We have a medical emergency, a severe anaphylactic reaction. Tell him to radio for medical support on the ground. And bring me the emergency medical kit. Now." Emily, pale but professional, rushed to do as she was told. Clara turned back to Marcus. His breathing was now a series of short, rasping wheezes. His face was swelling, his lips taking on a bluish tint. He was dying, and she was his only hope. "Sophie," Clara said, her tone firm but kind, addressing the hysterical woman beside him. "I need you to help me. We need to try and keep him upright. It will help him breathe." Sophie, grateful for a task, for a way to be useful, nodded tearfully and helped prop Marcus up. The performance was flawless. She was not just a flight attendant. She was a commander, a healer, the calm in the storm. The passengers looked on with a mixture of fear and awe. Emily returned with the large, red medical kit. Clara placed it on the floor and opened it, her movements swift and sure. She knew its contents by heart. She pulled out the oxygen mask and the portable tank. She also pulled out the airline-issued EpiPen, the final prop in her deadly play. "I'm going to give you some oxygen, sir," she said, her voice loud and clear for the benefit of her audience. She fitted the mask over his face. Then, she held up the EpiPen. "This is an epinephrine auto-injector. It will help with the reaction. I am trained to administer it." She pulled the blue safety cap off the top and the orange cap off the bottom, exposing the needle. "Sophie, I need you to hold his legs still," she commanded, with a final, desperate look into Marcus Thorne's dying eyes, a look that communicated everything: the memory of Rome, the betrayal, the forged bonds, her father's grave. She pressed the needle firmly into his outer thigh, holding it there for a 3 count. 1, 2, 3. She pulled it away. There was a single, small drop of blood on his trousers. She had done everything by the book. She had followed the procedure perfectly. But she knew it would do nothing. The airline-issued EpiPen she had just used was one she had personally tampered with weeks ago. During a routine check, she had used a fine needle to drain the vial of its life-saving epinephrine and replaced it with a harmless saline solution, resealing the puncture hole with a tiny, invisible drop of surgical glue. It was a dud, a prop, a stage dagger. It was a piece of evidence that would prove her innocence, her heroic but ultimately futile attempt to save a man's life. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled, theatrical desperation. Clara continued to administer oxygen. She spoke to Marcus in a calm, soothing voice, even as the light began to fade from his eyes. She checked his pulse, her face a mask of grim concentration. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that due to a medical emergency, the flight was being diverted to the nearest major airport, Munich, Germany. But Clara knew they would be too late. She watched, with a cold, detached fascination, as the last vestiges of life left the man who had destroyed hers. His body went limp, his head slumped to one side. Clara continued to check his pulse for another minute, for the sake of appearances. Then, she looked up, first at Sophie, then at the ring of horrified passengers watching her. She allowed her mask of professional composure to finally fall, replaced by an expression of profound, tragic defeat. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with a perfectly feigned emotion. "He's gone. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Sophie let out a soul-shattering wail. Clara gently removed the oxygen mask from Marcus's face and closed his now empty blue eyes. She had done it. In front of more than a dozen witnesses, she had executed her former lover, and in the process had made herself a hero. As the giant aircraft began its controlled descent towards Munich, Clara felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She looked out the window at the dark, sleeping world below. The storm inside her, the rage that had consumed her for 5 years, was finally quiet. The descent of the plane was a metaphor for her own. She had descended into a darkness from which she knew she could never return. But as she looked at her own reflection in the window, she saw no monster. She saw only justice. The arrival in Munich was a blur of flashing lights and official, somber faces. The aircraft was directed to a remote part of the tarmac, where a fleet of emergency vehicles, paramedics, airport police, and coroner's officials was waiting. The passengers were kept on board, the cabin a strange, suspended world of hushed whispers and shocked silence, while the body of Julian Vance was respectfully and officially removed from the plane. Clara was the star witness. She was praised by the captain for her calm, professional handling of the crisis. The passengers who had witnessed the event spoke of her with awe, describing to the German authorities how she had fought valiantly to save the man's life, how she had been a pillar of strength in a terrifying situation. Clara gave her statement to a stern-faced officer from the Luftfahrtbundesamt, Germany's Federal Aviation Authority. Her account was clear, concise, and filled with a compelling, understated grief. She detailed the rapid onset of the symptoms, the victim's own words about his allergy, her search for his personal EpiPen, and her subsequent use of the aircraft's medical kit. She was the picture of a dedicated professional who had been faced with a tragic, unavoidable death. Sophie, the victim's fiancée, was too consumed by grief to give a coherent statement, but her fragmented words only served to corroborate Clara's story. She tried so hard to save him, she sobbed. The initial findings were straightforward. A tragic, unforeseen accident. A man with a known severe allergy had somehow been exposed to the allergen on a flight, had been unable to locate his own medication, and had succumbed despite the heroic efforts of the cabin crew. The airline would face a lawsuit, there would be an internal investigation into how the allergen got on board, but criminal foul play was not even a remote consideration. After giving their statements, the crew and passengers were put up in an airport hotel for the night, waiting for a replacement flight to New York. In the sterile anonymity of her hotel room, Clara allowed herself a single, shuddering breath of release. She had done it. She had committed the perfect murder. The satisfaction she felt was not a hot, fiery triumph, but a cold, quiet peace. The ghost that had haunted her was finally gone. But perfect crimes only exist in fiction. In the real world, there are always loose threads, small, overlooked details that, when pulled, can unravel the most carefully woven tapestry of lies. The loose thread in Clara's case was a quiet, methodical man named Klaus Richter. Richter was not a policeman. He was a senior investigator for the German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation, the BFU. His job was to analyze every incident, no matter how minor, that occurred in German airspace. The death of a passenger mid-flight, while rare, fell under his purview. He was a man of process and detail, a man who believed that every effect had a cause, and that the official story was often just the cover of the book. Two things bothered Richter from the start. The first was the source of the allergen. The airline had a strict, no Brazil nuts policy due to the severity of that specific allergy. The catering company that supplied the first-class meals provided a detailed, verified list of ingredients. There was no possibility of cross-contamination. So where had the fatal dose come from? The second and more troubling detail was the failure of the airline-issued EpiPen. Richter had the device retrieved from the aircraft's medical kit and sent for analysis. The lab report was puzzling. The device had been deployed correctly, the needle had penetrated, but the vial inside contained only a simple saline solution. It was a complete dud. This was more than just a tragic malfunction. A saline solution doesn't simply appear in a sealed vial of epinephrine. It was a sign of deliberate tampering. Richter's investigation, which had been a routine procedural review, now became a criminal inquiry. He started with the victim. Julian Vance was a ghost. His passport was real, but his identity was a fabrication. It took 2 days of working with Interpol to uncover his true name from his fingerprints. Marcus Thorne, a man with a long and colorful history of fraud, a man wanted for questioning in connection with several high-profile confidence schemes across Europe and the Americas. The moment Richter had the real name, the entire complexion of the case changed. Men like Marcus Thorne do not die by accident. They make enemies, dangerous ones. Richter's focus then shifted to the crew, specifically to the heroic flight attendant, Clara Reed. Her file was exemplary. Her record was perfect, save for one glaring, red flag 5 years ago. Her arrest in connection with a fraud case involving forged bearer bonds. A case in which the primary suspect, who had vanished without a trace, was a man named Marcus Thorne. The coincidence was too great, too statistically impossible to ignore. A con man dies a mysterious death on a flight, and the flight attendant who tries to save him is the same woman whose life he had destroyed years earlier. Richter now had a motive. It was powerful, compelling, and deeply personal. He re-examined Clara's statement, her cool, professional demeanor, her flawless execution of emergency procedures. He saw it now not as heroism but as a performance, a brilliantly executed piece of theater. He suspected she had sabotaged the EpiPen, but he needed more. He needed to connect her to the allergen. He ordered a meticulous forensic search of Clara Reed's luggage, her uniform, and her personal belongings, which were still being held by the authorities in Munich. The search was painstaking. They found nothing in her suitcase, nothing in her apartment back in Dubai. But in the hidden, inner pocket of the toiletries bag she had carried on board, the crime lab found what they were looking for. A microscopic trace, a few infinitesimal particles, of Bertholletia excelsa, Brazil nut protein. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The motive, the means, and the opportunity were all there, supported by a single damning piece of forensic evidence. Clara was in New York when the call came. She had been reinstated to duty, the airline having already concluded its internal review with a finding of no fault on her part. She was preparing for a flight to Singapore when 2 federal agents approached her at the airport. They were accompanied by Klaus Richter. He was an unassuming man, with quiet eyes that seemed to see everything. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts, one after another, with a calm, dispassionate precision. He spoke of Marcus Thorne. He spoke of the sabotaged EpiPen. And he spoke of the microscopic trace of Brazil nut found in her bag. Clara listened, her face betraying no emotion. The serene, professional mask that had been her armor for so long remained firmly in place. When he was finished, a long silence hung in the small, sterile room. "Do you have anything to say, Ms. Reed?" Richter asked. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed a genuine emotion to show in her eyes. It was not fear. It was not regret. It was a profound, unshakable sense of peace. "He took everything from me," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "My job, my savings, my reputation. He killed my father. He left me with nothing but a name he had destroyed. All I did was return the favor. It was a confession, cold, clear, and utterly without remorse." The trial was a media sensation. The story of the Angel of Death air hostess splashed across tabloids worldwide. But Clara remained serene, detached from the circus she had created. She had known the risks. She had known that even the most perfect plan could be undone by a single microscopic mistake. But she had taken the chance, and she had succeeded in her ultimate goal. Marcus Thorne was dead. The debt had been paid. As she was sentenced, stripped of the uniform that had been both her identity and her weapon, she felt no despair. She had exchanged one form of confinement for another. She had spent 5 years in a prison of grief and rage. The walls of a real prison seemed a small price to pay for the silence she had finally found in her own mind. The shocking act had been committed, the final destination reached. And for Clara Reed, in a strange and